The mountain man stood in her doorway like a shadow carved from stone, his arms heavy with beaver pelts that gleamed like liquid midnight in the dying light. 10 furs of fortune that could buy a woman's survival through the brutal winter, offered without shame for a single night in her bed. But Eliza Morgan, whose mourning veil had barely settled on her shoulders, saw something in those ice-blue eyes that spoke of a hunger far deeper than flesh. She should have turned him away, should have slammed the door on his brazen proposal. Instead, she stepped aside and let him in, unknowing that this transaction would transform them both in ways neither gold nor pelts could ever measure. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. Jacob Whitmore set the bundle of furs on her rough-hewn table, with hands that had forgotten gentleness, and when he spoke his name, the words came out rusty and uncertain, like a gate that hadn't swung open in half a decade. And Eliza found herself studying those hands, scarred and weathered and trembling ever so slightly as she moved about her small kitchen, preparing supper from the meager stores in her larder. Venison stew and cornbread that seemed pitiful fare for a man who'd just offered her a fortune in pelts. He told her, haltingly at first and then with gathering momentum, like a river breaking through winter ice, about the high country where he'd trapped alone for 5 years, about the silence that wasn't peaceful but suffocating, about how a man could forget the sound of his own voice when there was no one to hear it, how he'd come down from the mountains not because he craved a woman's body, but because he was desperate for proof that he was still human, still capable of connection, still more than just another animal moving through the wilderness. The furs, he explained with something like shame coloring his weathered cheeks, weren't meant as insult to her dignity, but simply the only language he remembered in the high country. Everything had value that could be weighed and measured and traded, and he'd lost the words for asking what he truly needed without offering payment in return. Eliza ladled stew into chipped bowls and found herself confessing, though she'd meant to stay silent, that her husband Samuel had died 3 months past in a collapsed mineshaft, that the whole town had called it tragedy and gathered around her with casseroles and sympathy. But none of them understood that she'd been alone long before the mountain took him, that their marriage had been respectable and cold and empty as a church in winter. She saw recognition flicker in Jacob's ice-blue eyes, that same hollowed-out ache she glimpsed in her mirror each morning when she pinned up her hair and fastened her widow's weeds, and something unspoken passed between them in that moment, not desire, not yet, but understanding that ran deeper than flesh ever could. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the scrape of spoons against earthenware, and then Jacob began to talk again, his words coming easier now, telling her about the wife and daughter he'd had before the mountains, how fever had taken them both in a single brutal week, how he'd buried them in ground, so frozen he'd had to build fires to soften the earth enough to dig, how he'd walked away from everything afterward because staying meant drowning in memories that had teeth. His daughter had been 4 years old, he said with a voice that cracked like river ice in spring, with hair the color of wheat and a laugh that sounded like church bells. And his wife Mary had been the kind of woman who could make a house feel like home with nothing more than her presence. The kind of woman who sang while she worked and never complained about the hardships of frontier life, and losing them had felt like losing his own soul. Eliza felt tears on her cheeks, the first she'd shed since Samuel's funeral, and she told Jacob things she'd never spoken aloud, how her marriage had been arranged by her father to settle a debt, how Samuel had been a good provider but a distant husband, how she'd shared his bed for 7 years without ever feeling truly seen, how the loneliness of widowhood felt no different than the loneliness of marriage, except now she didn't have to pretend otherwise. She spoke of the small humiliations of her marriage, how Samuel would eat his meals in silence and retire to bed without a word, how he'd never asked about her thoughts or dreams, how she'd become invisible in her own home, a ghost who cooked and cleaned and existed in the margins of a man's life without ever truly inhabiting it. The 10 furs sat forgotten in the corner as midnight came and went. As the fire burned down to embers and rebuilt itself from the logs, Jacob fed it with practiced efficiency. As two people who'd been hollowed out by loss and isolation found themselves filling each other's empty spaces with words and silence in equal measure, Jacob told her about the mountains, about the way dawn broke over the high peaks with a beauty that hurt to witness, about the wolves that sang to the moon and the elk that moved through the valleys like ghosts, about how he'd thought the wilderness would heal him, but instead it had only taught him how to survive without living. Eliza spoke of the town, of the suffocating expectations and the endless judgment, of how women were expected to be grateful for any husband regardless of whether that husband saw them as partners or possessions, of how she'd spent 7 years playing the role of dutiful wife, while dying a little more inside each day. Dawn crept pale and hesitant through the window glass, painting everything in shades of gray and silver, and Jacob rose from his chair with obvious reluctance, his body moving with the stiffness of a man who'd sat too long in one position, assuming their transaction, such as it was or wasn't, had reached its natural conclusion. But Eliza surprised them both by asking him to stay for breakfast, her voice small and uncertain, and when he nodded, she found herself asking him to stay another night, and another, not for the original arrangement but simply because the house felt less like a tomb when he was in it. He moved his camp to her barn that very morning, hauling his gear and traps and the few possessions a mountain man accumulated, a bedroll worn thin with use, cooking pots blackened by countless fires, pelts in various stages of preparation, and a rifle that looked older than either of them, and by afternoon the town had noticed, because towns always noticed, especially when a widow barely out of mourning had a strange man living on her property. Margaret Hastings came calling the next day with a basket of preserves and a heart full of concern, settling herself at Eliza's kitchen table with the air of a woman on a mission of mercy, speaking in hushed tones about propriety and reputation and what people were saying, about how Eliza needed to think of her standing in the community, about how a woman alone was vulnerable to gossip that could destroy her. Margaret meant well, Eliza understood that, but her words carried the weight of a lifetime spent conforming to expectations, of dreams deferred and desires suppressed in service of what others deemed acceptable. Eliza listened to her neighbor's well-meaning warnings and felt something shift inside her chest, some tightly wound spring finally releasing its tension, and she realized with startling clarity that she didn't care what the town thought, that their judgment meant nothing compared to the way she'd laughed the previous evening when Jacob told her about a fox that had stolen his breakfast, that their propriety was a cage she'd lived in all her life. Without understanding, she could simply walk away. She thanked Margaret kindly but firmly, showing her to the door with a grace that left no room for argument. And when Jacob came in from mending the barn door, his shirt damp with honest sweat and his hands full of tools, she met his questioning gaze and smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in longer than she could remember. And he smiled back with a hesitance that spoke of a man rediscovering expressions he'd thought lost forever. That night they sat by the fire again, not speaking as much as the previous evening but comfortable in the silence. And Eliza realized that what had begun as a transaction born of mutual desperation had transformed into something she couldn't quite name but desperately wanted to protect, this fragile thing growing between two people who'd forgotten they were capable of growth. Jacob whittled a piece of pine into the rough shape of a bird, his knife moving with the unconscious grace of long practice, shavings falling like snow onto the hearth, and Eliza mended a shirt by lamplight, her needle moving in and out of the fabric with the rhythm of meditation. And outside the autumn wind rattled the windows, while inside they built something new from the ruins of their separate griefs. Two strangers becoming something more than strangers, finding in each other not salvation, for they were both too broken for such grand gestures, but simply the possibility that broken things could still fit together, could still create something whole and warm and worth protecting from the cold judgment of a world that measured worth in propriety rather than truth. As the fire burned low and the night deepened around them, Eliza found herself studying Jacob's profile in the flickering light, noting the way his brow furrowed in concentration as he worked, the way his shoulders had begun to relax from the defensive hunch he'd carried when he first arrived. And she understood with perfect clarity that whatever was happening between them was precious precisely because it was honest, because neither of them was pretending to be anything other than what they were, two wounded souls seeking shelter from their separate storms, finding in each other's company not passion or romance but something simpler and more profound, the basic human comfort of being seen and accepted without judgment or expectation. Jacob started with the porch on a crisp October morning, when the air tasted of wood smoke and dying leaves, pulling out rotted boards with careful precision and replacing them with fresh-cut pine that still wept sap. And Eliza watched from the kitchen window as he worked, noting the way he moved with the confidence of a man who understood how things fit together, how they could be made whole again through patience and skill. When she offered him payment for the work, counting out coins from the small cash Samuel had left her, Jacob tried to refuse, but she insisted with a firmness that surprised them both, telling him she wouldn't accept charity, that she needed to maintain her dignity and independence even as she accepted his help. and he respected that, understanding that pride was sometimes all a person had left when everything else had been stripped away. They fell into a rhythm over the following weeks, a dance of domesticity that felt both strange and natural, as if they were learning steps to a song they'd both heard before but never quite mastered. Jacob chopped wood for winter, his axe rising and falling with metronomic precision, splitting logs into pieces small enough for the stove, stacking them against the side of the house in neat rows that spoke of preparation and forethought. He mended the barn roof where shingles had come loose, replacing them before the autumn rains could rot the underlying wood. And he fixed the gate that had hung crooked for longer than Eliza could remember. And with each repair he made, the homestead began to look less like a place that was slowly dying and more like somewhere people actually lived. In the evenings, Eliza would sit with him at the kitchen table with Samuel's old book spread between them, teaching Jacob to read beyond the simple words he'd mastered as a child, watching his scarred fingers trace lines of text as he sounded out syllables with the concentration of a man attacking a difficult problem. He was smart, she realized, quick to learn once he understood the patterns, and he approached reading the way. He approached everything else with careful attention and a willingness to persist through frustration. She started with simple passages from the Bible, then moved to a collection of poems her mother had given her years ago, watching his face light up when he successfully decoded a particularly difficult word. He would practice in the evenings after supper, his lips moving silently as he worked through sentences, and sometimes he would look up at her with such genuine pleasure at his progress that her heart would catch in her chest. In return, he taught her things the town had never bothered with, skills that existed beyond the boundaries of propriety and parlor manners. He showed her how to track rabbits by the disturbed leaves and bent grass, how to read weather in the quality of light and the behavior of birds, how to set snares and check them without leaving obvious signs of human presence. He taught her to shoot his rifle, standing behind her to correct her stance, his hands guiding hers on the weapon until she could hit a target more often than not. And she felt a fierce pride in this new competence, this knowledge that she could survive beyond the town's edges if she needed to. He showed her which plants could be eaten and which would poison, how to start a fire in wet conditions, how to navigate by the stars when the trails disappeared under snow. Their partnership became one of equals, each filling gaps in the other's knowledge and capability, building something together that was stronger than what either could have managed alone. She taught him numbers beyond basic counting, showed him how to keep accounts and manage money, and he taught her the patience required to wait hours for game to appear, the stillness that was its own kind of meditation. The first snow came in early November, fat flakes that fell lazy and thick, covering the world in white silence. And Jacob stood at the barn door watching it fall with an expression Eliza couldn't quite read, something that looked like longing mixed with dread. That evening, as they sat by the fire, he confessed that he dreaded returning to the high country alone, that the thought of another winter in the mountains filled him with a terror he couldn't quite name, but he also felt he had no right to ask for more than she'd already given, no right to impose on her hospitality indefinitely. Eliza set down her mending and looked at him across the firelight, this man who'd become essential to her days without her quite noticing how it happened, and she admitted that she was terrified of facing another winter in the empty house where every corner held memories of her loveless marriage, that the thought of him leaving made her chest ache in ways she didn't want to examine too closely. They made a new arrangement that night, speaking carefully around the words they weren't quite ready to say, agreeing that he would winter with her not as a hired hand or a transaction but as a companion, as someone who shared her space and her life without the pretense of anything more formal than mutual need and growing affection. The town's disapproval, which had been simmering quietly through the autumn, grew louder as winter settled in and Jacob showed no signs of leaving. The minister, Reverend Harrison, came calling on a gray December afternoon, settling his considerable bulk into Eliza's best chair and speaking in the unctuous tones of a man who believed his moral authority superseded human complexity, expressing concern about scandal and the appearance of impropriety, suggesting that Eliza was damaging not just her own soul but setting a poor example for the community's young women. He spoke at length about the sanctity of widowhood, about the proper mourning period that should be observed, about how her behavior was unseemly and reflected poorly on Samuel's memory. Eliza listened, with a patience she didn't feel, and thanked him for his concern with a politeness that didn't reach her eyes, And she did not promise to send Jacob away, did not offer the reassurances the Reverend clearly expected, and he left with his jowls quivering in indignation and his eyes promising future consequences. Worse than the minister was Thomas Morgan, Samuel's older brother, who arrived a week later with the self-righteous fury of a man who believed he had every right to control a woman's choices simply because she'd been married to his brother. He stood in her kitchen and called her a disgrace, threatened to contest her property rights, claimed she was disgracing the family name by living in sin with a mountain savage, and his words were designed to wound, to shame her into compliance, through fear of losing everything she had. He spoke of family honor and propriety, of what Samuel would have wanted, wielding her dead husband's memory like a weapon meant to bludgeon her into submission. Jacob, who'd been in the barn when Thomas arrived, came in halfway through the tirade and stood silent in the doorway, his presence a quiet support that gave Eliza the strength to face down her brother-in-law's bluster. She told Thomas, with a calm that belied the fury burning in her chest, that the property was hers by legal right, that his brother's memory didn't give him ownership over her life, and that if he chose to make trouble he would find her more than capable of fighting back. Thomas left with threats hanging in the air like smoke, and after he'd gone, Eliza found herself shaking with reaction, with anger and fear and a strange exhilaration at having finally stood up for herself in a way she'd never managed during her marriage. The blizzard came in late December, howling down from the mountains with a fury that rattled the walls and piled snow against the doors in drifts that came up to the windows. Jacob and Eliza were trapped inside together, the world beyond, the house erased by white chaos, and the enforced intimacy of the storm broke down the last careful walls they'd maintained between them. They'd been circling this moment for months, both aware of the growing attraction but hesitant to name it, to acknowledge what it might mean. That night, with the wind screaming outside and the fire burning low, Jacob reached for her hand across the space between their chairs, and Eliza took it, and the touch was electric in its simplicity. They moved together slowly, carefully, each giving the other room to retreat, but neither did. In her bedroom, in the darkness broken only by the faint glow from the banked fire in the main room, they shed not just clothing but the armor they'd both worn against the world, the protective layers that had kept them safe but also kept them isolated. Jacob's hands trembled as they traced the curves of her body, and she realized he was afraid, not of her but of feeling too much, of letting himself be vulnerable to loss again. She kissed him with a tenderness that surprised them both, and he responded with a hunger that was about connection rather than conquest, about being seen and accepted in all his brokenness. When he wept great shuddering sobs that shook his whole frame, she held him and understood that these were the first tears he'd shed since his family died, that in her arms he'd finally found a place safe enough to grieve. And she, for the first time in her life, allowed herself to feel desire instead of duty, allowed herself to want and be wanted not as a wife fulfilling obligations but as a woman choosing her own pleasure and connection. They made love with a desperate intensity born of loneliness, finally finding its answer. And afterward they lay tangled together, their breathing gradually slowing to match, and both understood without speaking that what had begun as a business arrangement, as 10 furs offered for a single night, had transformed into something neither could name, but both desperately needed. Not love, perhaps, not yet, but the possibility of love, the foundation upon which love might eventually be built, if they were brave enough to let it happen. In the gray light of dawn, with the storm still raging outside, they woke still wrapped around each other, and neither pulled away, neither retreated into the careful distance they'd maintained before, and Eliza understood that they had crossed a threshold from which there was no returning, that whatever came next would have to be faced together or not at all. Thomas Morgan returned in early March with reinforcements, bringing Sheriff Coleman and a lawyer named Hutchins, who carried a leather satchel full of documents meant to prove Eliza's incompetence, and they arrived on a gray morning when the last snow was melting into mud and the world hung suspended between winter's death and spring's uncertain promise, the air still cold enough to frost breath but carrying the faint scent of earth awakening beneath the ice. Thomas stood in her parlor like a conquering general, his face red with righteous fury, declaring that Eliza was clearly of unsound mind, that no rational woman would disgrace herself and her late husband's memory by living in sin with a mountain savage, that he was prepared to petition the court for control of her property for her own good and for the protection of the Morgan family name. The lawyer shuffled his papers and spoke in dry legal terms about competency hearings and moral fitness, about how a widow's behavior reflected on her deceased husband's estate, about precedents in property law and the rights of family members to intervene when a woman showed signs of instability or diminished capacity. He cited cases from back east, spoke of women who'd been declared incompetent for far less egregious behavior than what Eliza was engaging in, suggested that a court would certainly side with family members who were only trying to protect their interests and hers. Sheriff Coleman stood uncomfortably by the door, his hat in his hands, looking like a man who'd been dragged into something he wanted no part of, his eyes fixed on the floor as if he could avoid the whole situation by simply not looking at it directly. Jacob emerged from the back room where he'd been repairing a chair, his presence filling the doorway with quiet menace, and though he said nothing, his hands, those scarred, capable hands that had learned such gentleness, hung loose at his sides in a way that suggested they could become dangerous, if necessary. Thomas turned his fury on Jacob then, calling him a savage and a corrupting influence, accusing him of taking advantage of a grieving widow for her property, threatening to see him run out of town or jailed for his predations, and his words were designed to provoke, to goad Jacob into violence that would justify his removal and prove everything Thomas claimed about him. But Jacob stood silent, his ice-blue eyes fixed on Thomas with an intensity that made the other man falter mid-sentence, and it was Eliza who stepped forward, her voice cutting through Thomas's bluster like a knife through silk. She told him, with a clarity that left no room for argument, that she was of perfectly sound mind, that every choice she'd made had been her own, that his brother's death didn't give him ownership over her life or her property, and that if he wanted to challenge her competency in court, she would welcome the opportunity to explain to a judge exactly how competent she was and exactly how her marriage to Samuel had been a cage she'd finally escaped. She spoke with the precision of someone who'd thought through every word, every argument, prepared for this confrontation since the day Thomas had first threatened her, and her voice never wavered even as her hands trembled slightly at her sides. The confrontation grew uglier then, Thomas's composure cracking as he called her a whore and a disgrace, his voice rising to a shout that brought several neighbors to their windows, peering through curtains to witness the spectacle. And Eliza stood her ground, refusing to be shamed or intimidated, her spine straight and her eyes blazing with a fury she'd suppressed for too many years. She told Thomas that his brother had been a cold, distant man who'd treated her like property rather than a partner, that she'd spent 7 years being invisible in her own home, and that she would rather die than return to that kind of existence. And her words were like bullets finding their mark, in Thomas's armor of self-righteousness. Margaret Hastings appeared at the door then, having heard the commotion from her house down the road, and behind her came several other townswomen, Sarah Fletcher and Ruth Anderson and Mary Kate O'Brien, women who'd watched Eliza's transformation over the winter, who'd seen her come alive in ways she never had during her marriage, who'd witnessed the quiet partnership she'd built with Jacob and recognized it as something genuine rather than scandalous. Margaret spoke up in Eliza's defense, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd lived in the town for 40 years and whose opinion carried weight, saying that she'd never seen Eliza more clear-minded or capable, that whatever arrangement she had with Jacob Whitmore was her own business and nobody else's, that the town would do better to mind its own affairs rather than trying to control a grown woman's choices. The other women murmured agreement, and Sarah Fletcher added that she'd seen plenty of so-called proper marriages that were far more shameful than what Eliza and Jacob had, that respect and partnership mattered more than appearances, and Ruth Anderson said quietly that some people seemed more interested in controlling women than in helping them, and wasn't that the real scandal? Sheriff Coleman, seizing on this as his escape from an impossible situation, declared that he saw no cause for arrest or intervention, that a woman's choices about who she kept company with weren't matters for the law unless actual crimes were being committed, and he could see no evidence of any crime here. Thomas sputtered with rage, his face going from red to purple, but the lawyer Hutchins, reading the room and recognizing a losing battle, suggested they reconsider their approach, perhaps consult with other legal minds, and the two men left with threats that rang hollow now that the community support Thomas had counted on had failed to materialize. After they'd gone, Eliza found herself shaking with reaction, and the women who defended her stayed for coffee, their presence a quiet show of solidarity that meant more than she could express. and they talked not about the confrontation but about ordinary things, spring planting and preserves and a new family moving to town, as if to say that Eliza's life was ordinary too, that her choices didn't make her strange or shameful but simply human. When they finally left, she sat by the fire feeling both victorious and exhausted, understanding that she'd crossed a line from which there was no returning, that she'd publicly claimed her right to choose her own path, and would have to live with whatever consequences came from that choice. But that night, when the house had grown dark and quiet, she found Jacob in the barn packing his saddlebags with the methodical care of a man preparing for a long journey, and when she demanded to know what he was doing, he told her without meeting her eyes that he was leaving, that he'd destroyed her standing in the community, that she deserved better than a half-wild mountain man with no prospects and a past full of ghosts, that he couldn't bear to be the reason she lost everything she had. He spoke in the flat, emotionless tone of someone who'd made a decision and was trying to convince himself it was the right one, and he wouldn't look at her as he folded his bedroll and secured his traps. Eliza felt fury rise in her chest like a living thing, hot and righteous and absolute, and she told him he was a coward and a fool, that he was doing exactly what every man in her life had always done, making decisions for her, as if she were incapable of choosing for herself, robbing her of her agency in the name of protecting her. She told him she didn't need his nobility or his self-sacrifice, that what she needed was his honesty, that if he wanted to leave because he didn't want to stay, then he should go, but he shouldn't dare leave claiming it was for her benefit, when it was really about his own fear. Her voice broke on the last word, and that crack in her composure seemed to break through his careful control in ways her anger hadn't. They fought then, truly fought, their voices rising in the barn with the horses shifting nervously in their stalls, and all the careful politeness and measured distance they'd maintained even in their closest moments, shattered under the weight of genuine conflict. Jacob finally broke, his careful control shattering as he shouted that yes, he was terrified, terrified of losing her the way he'd lost Mary and his daughter, terrified that he would fail her, terrified that he wasn't enough for a woman like her, that he would wake one morning and find she'd realized she'd made a terrible mistake, tying herself to a man who was more comfortable in the wilderness than in civilization. He told her he'd buried one family already and didn't think he could survive burying another, that loving her felt like standing at the edge of a cliff knowing the ground could give way at any moment, that he'd been running from connection for 5 years, because running was easier than risking that kind of pain again. Eliza felt her own anger drain away as she listened to his confession, and she told him with a quietness that was more powerful than shouting that she had her own fears, that she was terrified she would wake one morning and find this had all been a dream, that she wasn't worthy of being chosen for herself rather than for convenience or property or family obligation, that she'd spent so long being invisible that she couldn't quite believe someone actually saw her and chose to stay. She confessed that sometimes she still woke in the night convinced he would be gone, that this happiness was too fragile to last, that she was too damaged to deserve it. They stared at each other across the barn, two broken people recognizing their fears as mirrors of each other, understanding that what they were really afraid of wasn't loss or failure but vulnerability, the terrifying possibility of being truly known and potentially rejected. Jacob dropped his saddlebags and crossed the distance between them, and they came together not with the desperate passion of that first real night but with a tenderness that acknowledged their shared fragility, holding each other in the dim barn with the smell of hay and horses and leather surrounding them, making promises without words that they would be brave enough to choose each other every day, to face their fears together rather than running from them separately. They stood there for a long time, neither speaking, just holding each other as if they could merge into a single being that would be stronger than either of them alone. And gradually their breathing synchronized and their heartbeats slowed. And when they finally pulled apart enough to look at each other, both had tears on their cheeks and neither felt any shame about it. Spring came with a rush of green, and the sound of snowmelt running in every creek and gully, and on a warm April morning when the meadows were full of wildflowers and the air smelled of pine and possibility, they stood before a circuit judge in Eliza's parlor, with only a handful of witnesses, Margaret Hastings, and her husband, Sarah Fletcher, Ruth Anderson, and a few others who'd proven themselves true friends through the difficult winter. Eliza wore a simple dress of blue calico rather than widow's weeds, the first time she'd worn color in over a year, and Jacob wore new clothes that Eliza had helped him pick out in town, looking uncomfortable in the formal attire but standing straight and proud nonetheless. and when they spoke their vows, they looked at each other with a certainty that made even the skeptical judge smile. The words were traditional, but they invested them with meanings that went deeper than the surface when Jacob promised to love and cherish. Eliza heard him promising to see her always, to never let her become invisible again. When Eliza promised to honor and respect, Jacob heard her promising to value his strength without demanding he hide his vulnerability. Afterward, as their small group shared cake and coffee that Margaret had helped Eliza prepare, Eliza found herself looking at the 10 beaver pelts that still hung in the barn, visible through the open door, and she thought about that first night when Jacob had offered them for a single night in her bed, about how neither of them could have imagined what that transaction would actually buy. Those furs had bought far more than a night or even a winter of companionship. They'd bought them both a second chance at life, at love, at becoming the people they were meant to be rather than the people grief and loneliness had made them. They'd bought permission to be vulnerable, to be seen in all their brokenness and chosen anyway, to build something new from the ruins of their separate pasts. The furs still hung in the barn as a reminder that the most valuable transactions couldn't be measured in gold or pelts or any currency that changed hands, but rather in the courage required to open yourself to another person, to trust that your wounds wouldn't be weaponized against you, to believe that you were worthy of love not despite your damage but including it. As the last guest departed and the sun began its slow descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose and violet, Jacob took Eliza's hand and led her outside, and they stood together looking at the land they would work together, the life they would build together, the future that stretched before them full of possibility and challenge, and the ordinary miracle of being truly seen and choosing to stay anyway. Eliza understood with perfect clarity that what had begun as desperation and loneliness had been transformed by time and trust and tremendous courage into something that approached grace, not the grace of churches and propriety, but the messier, more human grace of two wounded people helping each other heal, of broken pieces fitting together to create something stronger than what either had been alone, of love that wasn't perfect or easy but was real and chosen, and worth every sacrifice they'd made to claim it. They would face more challenges. She knew the town's judgment wouldn't disappear overnight. Thomas might yet cause trouble. The wilderness and weather and simple bad luck could test them in ways they couldn't anticipate, but they would face those challenges together, and that made all the difference. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, she leaned into Jacob's solid warmth and